Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video for History by Podcast. Today I'm live with James Valiant and Professor Bart Ehrman. Well, welcome back to the show, Bart. It's been a little while since we last
Yeah.
did a video, and the last one we did was on was on your latest book on the what was it? And now
I
I'm
can't even
embarrassed.
remember. It's
Yeah,
the
the
latest
one we
one is
did
called
before, yeah,
Armageddon.
Armageddon. I
Yeah.
just remembered it. Yep,
Yeah.
right
Well,
there.
it means the end's coming soon, and maybe it came already.
But today we're going to be talking about Forged, and I really wanted to talk about this book with you for a while. And you really get into the meat of it in Forged because it's this very super complicated topic about how do scholars tell the difference between what is supposed to be authentic to somebody that lived 2,000 years ago and what wasn't, and sorting out the language and differences and different traditions about those texts and said people. Like scholars think that 7 letters were written by Paul, but there's 13 of them. Well, some say 14 if you include Hebrews, but Hebrews never claims to have been written by Paul. But basically, 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. 7 of them are deemed authentic by the majority of scholars, and 6 of them are not. And you have First and Second Peter, which many scholars think are fake, and etc. etc. So, Bart, I guess my first question is methodology. How do scholars sort out this mess of what is pseudoepigrapha and what is not?
Yeah. So, thanks, and it's a really important question, and one of the
Mm.
reasons it's tricky is because people tend to mean different things by the term forgery. And when scholars use it in this context, they mean something pretty specific, which is what you were talking about, which is if you it has to do with who the author really was. This is what we mean by forgery. If somebody writes a book claiming to be a famous person, knowing full well that he's someone else, that's what we're calling a forgery. So we're not talking about like when somebody makes up stories about Jesus or somebody fabricates something or somebody like changes what someone else wrote or those are all very important issues, but they're not what we're talking about when we talk about forgery. Forgery is somebody claiming to be someone they're not when they write. It's a phenomenon still today, of course, and there are experts today who tried to decide is this really a book written by Charles Dickens or not, or Mark Twain or whatever. When we're dealing with antiquity, it's a very big issue and a problematic issue, but it's a big issue because there were a lot more people writing forgeries in the ancient world than there are today, in part because it was easier to get away with. They didn't have the data retrieval systems and the computer capacities we have today to check handwriting style and grammatical differences and things like that, and so it wasn't as hard to get away with it. But so scholars who study the ancient world use pretty much the criteria that scholars use today to decide if you've got suppose you've got a handful of books written by a person and there's another book that claims to be written by the same person. Well, you compare them. Is the writing style similar or really different? The vocabulary, is it completely different or basically the same? Are the ideas the same? Are there ideas that are actually conflicting with the other one? Are there things that are presupposed that show that this person wasn't living in the right time frame for that person? And so you look at a range of things like that, and then you have to make a determination on a case by case basis.
So, for example, with the so-called pastoral epistles of Paul,
Mm-hmm.
letters that claim to be written by Paul to
Mm-hmm.
Titus or to Timothy, or
Mm-hmm.
in those, there's a general scholarly consensus because they seem to be bringing up whole new issues that
Mm-hmm.
hadn't been raised in the earlier Pauline letters, such as church organization,
Mm-hmm.
officials in the church, organizing the church in Crete or something. And those seem to be at a later stage. Most scholars put the authentic Pauline letters at the earliest stage,
Yeah.
mid first century. And these letters seem to be discussing organizational issues, for example.
Yeah.
And so this leads most scholars, to believe that the pastorals, for example, are pseudoepigrapha. Uh, Now, it's that part that says by Paul that's the pseudo part, right?
That's
Uh,
right.
and it's the content, though, that tells us, hey, whole new ideas have been introduced
Mhm.
to these letters that were not present in these earlier, presumably earlier letters. That's the gist of it.
Yeah, and that's right. That's exactly right. And the important qualifying point is that these discussions of church organization and things, they are different from Paul's letters, but it's not, and it's not just that they're different, but they're contrary, because we know how Paul's churches were organized based on his authentic letters. You read First Corinthians. First Corinthians, the Corinthian church is a mess. If you read through Corinthians, he goes problem by problem. I mean, they're at each other's throats.
Right. Yeah.
They're all, they're taking each other to court over like disagreements. You have these gross immoral things going on. You have men visiting prostitutes and bragging about it in church. You've got people who coming to the Lord's Supper, which is a shared meal, and getting drunk, and and so you got a guy sleeping with his stepmother. You have this. These are the people that Paul begins the letter by saying he's writing to the saints who are in Corinth. Just, wow, what do the sinners look like? Wow, that's quite amazing. But but when Paul writes to deal with these problems, he doesn't write the church leaders and say, look, get your people in order. You're supposed to have control of these people. You're the shepherd of the sheep. And he doesn't write to the leaders. And the reason he doesn't write the leaders is because there weren't any leaders yet. In Paul's churches, it was understood that the Holy Spirit was guiding people in how they were to live and to behave and perform. And when you get to the pastoral epistles, there's none of that. The pastoral epistles is you've got bishops, and you've got deacons, and you've got these orders of people and that are running the show, and not in Paul's. So it's a difference. So it's things Paul doesn't talk about that in fact run contrary to what he does talk about.
In a lot of the, if I may, just one more.
Yeah, sure.
In a lot of the content issues, people will often put forth the idea of what they so-called pious fraud, where they sincerely believed it, or they had a vision, or there's some interpretation or some experience they had that informed them that Jesus must have said this or something. Is that distinguishable from these attributions of the letters to Paul? I mean, could someone have said, I had the Holy Spirit visited me, I had an ecstatic vision and told me that Paul wrote this letter, contents. Paul communicated the contents of this to me through a vision or something. Yeah.
So a lot, as you know, most scholars of the New Testament tend to be Christian, and they revere the Bible, even when they recognize that the historical scholars recognize that, Paul didn't really write these letters. Of course, fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals, most evangelicals will say, oh, yes, he did. And so you could have that debate. But if you genuinely, on historical grounds, think, look, Paul just didn't write these letters, and you have reasons for thinking so, but you have an attachment to the Bible as a source of reverence for your Christian tradition, then you have to have some other explanation other than, well, somebody's lying about it. They're forging this. And so that's why people started coming up with these ideas that try to excuse the practice. It's a pious fraud, or the person was inspired by the Spirit to claim they were Paul. It was the Spirit, and this is the Spirit speaking what Paul would have said if he were in this context. And you come up with explanations like that. So I've got two books on this, as you know, Jim and Jacob. That the book Forged, Jacob, that you were referring to it's a book for a general audience, a broader audience, where I lay out a lot of this stuff. But for the really kind of hardcore stuff, where I really go for it for scholars, is my other book called Forgery and Counter Forgery. And Jim, as you know, that's where I really go after this question. Is it true that there are such things as pious frauds in the ancient world? Is it true that people thought that they could be inspired by the Spirit in order to claim to be somebody that they're not? What kind of evidence is there? Let's look at the evidence. Let's evaluate it. And in almost every instance, it's pretty clear these categories of pious fraud and stuff are just things people are making up. They're just modern people are just making stuff up because they don't like the idea that like somebody would lie about who their identity is, because obviously that's troubling, especially in the Bible. And so I get it, but I don't think there's any evidence for that kind of thing.
Thank you.
I think the super chat question. Mark Morledge, thank you for your super chat. What are the best conservative arguments for defending the traditional view for Pauline authorship of the pastoral letters 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I need to point out that, as Jim and I are saying, that this is it's a broad consensus among critical scholars that Paul did not write it, but a consensus doesn't mean absolute uniformity. There are very fine scholars who think maybe Paul did write them. My own teacher, Bruce Metzger, thought that Paul probably wrote them. One of the major commentaries on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus is by Luke Timothy Johnson, who had been a professor at Yale and Emory, and he argues that Paul probably wrote them. And so there are people who think that. They're very much in the minority, but they're smart people. One argument is that, look, the letters claim to be written by Paul, and you give the benefit of the doubt to the claim, which I agree with that. If you have a book that somebody claims to write, you give them the benefit of the doubt, unless you have really strong arguments against it. The main argument that Paul may have written these things is that if they're situated at the very end of his life, that things may have developed enough by that time for him to have changed his views on things, for him to start using a different kind of Christian vocabulary, for him, since they're written to individuals who are heading churches, that he might have a different writing style in these situations. And so you take seriously the possibility that, of course, people write different styles all the time, and everybody realizes that. But so some people just the basic conservative argument, the best conservative argument is that they think that the counter argument is not convincing enough.
So the tradition about, say, Paul's execution under Nero is just that, a tradition, and we hear about it rather late. So if we question the fact of when Paul died, let's say that the letters were written from between the 50s all the way to the 90s, which is within a human lifespan, wouldn't that make it conceivable that Paul could be responsible both for the early letters like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Galatians, and then also be responsible for the pastorals and later material, say, in the 80s or 90s?
It's possible. I mean, I think what you would probably want to do is date the pastorals. The thing is, sorry, I keep breaking up my sentences here, but the reality is that people who want to say Paul wrote these letters are pretty convinced Paul died in 64. But there's no, as you say, there's no real compelling reason for that. The first time Paul's death is actually mentioned is in the book of 1st Clement, and that's almost always dated to the year 95. The author of this it's kind of a community project. It claims to be written by the church in Rome, and it mentions Paul and Peter having been martyred. And the tradition emerges, of course, that it was during the reign of Nero. The book of Acts in the New Testament seems to know that Paul's going to get martyred soon after his sojourn in Rome. And so people tend to date it in the mid-60s, but there's no reason that you have to. You could argue it's not, but then you bear the burden of proof for that, I would say. So what people tend to do is to say that, okay, Paul writes 1 Corinthians in the year 55 or something. Well, 8 or 9 years later, I mean, the whole situation's different, and he's writing a different thing and so it's possible, and it absolutely is possible. It's possible that, Luke wrote the pastoral epistles. It's possible that Silas wrote the pastoral epistles. Anything's possible. Anything. I mean, it's not possible I wrote them. I'm old, but I'm not that old. And so that's possible. But it's not, that's not, but so the issue with this kind of thing is how you establish probabilities. And there are some arguments that are just so good for I'll give you one. I'll give you one for the pastorals, is that sometimes the pastoral epistles will use a word that's very common in Paul. That's like it's a major word for Paul. And he'll use it in a sense that Paul absolutely does not use it in, the word faith. Faith is an important word for Paul, and faith in the pastorals does not mean what Paul means by the term faith. For Paul, faith means it's a relational term. It means trust in what God has done. You're trusting God to provide salvation through Christ. It's a relationship of trust with God. And in the pastorals, it's not that at all. Faith is the content of what you believe. It's the propositional truths. So keeping the faith means that you agree with these ideas. And that's just not what Paul meant. So the thing is, you pile up arguments, and after a while, you start getting argument after argument after argument. In my book, Forgery and Counter Forgery, man, I have page after page after page of arguments on this one. And it's like at the end of the day, you just say, yeah, okay, probably Paul didn't write them.
Does this include the author attribution to the Gospels? Do you think that's for the matter of forgery? I mean, there are pious Christians who believe the disciple and apostle Matthew wrote Matthew,
Yeah.
or that the apostle John wrote the Gospel of John.
Right.
Do you think those are forged attributions?
So this is where definitions get really even more sticky than I mentioned earlier, because Matthew, of course, circulates under the name Matthew, but the author himself doesn't call himself Matthew. So the reason people started calling Matthew sometime in the 2nd century after the book had been in circulation for a long time. The author never says, I'm Matthew. He doesn't ever talk in the first person. He gives an account of how Matthew became Jesus' disciple. The call of Matthew is in Matthew in the chapter 9 of the Gospel of Matthew. And there's nothing. People need to read this. Just read Matthew 9. I think it's like verses 9 to 13 or something, that where Jesus calls Matthew, the tax collector, to be his followers. And just ask yourself, if you're reading this, is there any hint that the author's talking about himself? The answer is no. And so the author doesn't claim this. The gospel that we have in our early manuscripts has a title on it, kata matayan, which means according to Matthew. Well, that's not a title that an author puts on a book. In other words, when I wrote my book Armageddon, I did not entitle the book according to Bart Ehrman. That's not the title of the book. That's when somebody's telling you who wrote the book, right? And so you've got this anonymous book of Matthew floating around, and people want to know who wrote that. And people came up with the idea, I think it was Matthew, the tax collector. And so then they put kata matayan, according to Matthew, to differentiate it from according to Mark and according to Luke and according to John. So in this case, it's not forgery by my definition, because the author is not claiming to be someone other than who he is. It's somebody else saying that it's that person. And so
whereas the letters ascribed to Peter just simply appear to be written in a totally different context than the historical Peter.
Yeah.
And therefore, our Peter, who it claims to be written by, simply cannot be the author.
That's right, especially 2 Peter. I mean, even my mentor, Bruce Metzger, agreed 2 Peter was not written by Peter. I mean, the evidence on that one is so overwhelming that unless somebody's a very, very conservative evangelical or a fundamentalist, most people say, 2 Peter, I don't think so.
There was almost like a cottage industry as time wore on of certain kinds of frauds. For example, Jerome mentions that there is a correspondence between the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who was a tutor and advisor to the Emperor Nero, and Paul. And there's actually a correspondence. We actually have a text of correspondence between allegedly Paul and Nero that Jerome, by 400 is aware of.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively early thing, and it appears to be totally forged in content.
Yeah. It's absolutely forged. Everybody, these letters, so there, 13 or 14 letters back and forth between Seneca and Paul. And there's no one who knows anything about like anything, the early Christian church, or can read Latin. They're in Latin, thinks that they're actually kind of funny, because Seneca gives Paul a hard time for not having very good, not being very good at Latin.
But how to put this nicely, there appear to be multiple instances where we have documents. I mean, and of course, with the Nag Hammadi discoveries, we discovered all these Gnostic documents, which also have attributions that appear to be dubious on their face. There appears to be a whole cottage industry of this kind of forgery during the Roman period of Christianity.
That's true. And it's the thing is, nobody doubts it. Everybody agrees. With Paul, you got 3 Corinthians, you got the letter to the Laodiceans. We know that there used to be a letter to the Alexandrians. We know that, we've got this correspondence of Paul and Seneca. Nobody thinks any of that's authentic, which means that a number of somebodies, these are all different authors, are claiming to be Paul, knowing full well that they're not. And so it's not a question of whether would a Christian do that. Yes, Christians did that. The only question that most people have is it possible that anyone who did that had a book that made it into the New Testament? Because people are nervous when you talk about the New Testament, that happening in the New Testament, even though they agree it happened all over the place after the New Testament. And so what scholars do is they apply the same criteria to the New Testament books that they apply to the other books to make a decision. And it's not that they're out to, to prove or disprove anything. They just want to know. If Paul didn't write First Timothy, that's important. Or if he didn't write Ephesians, which, a lot of people don't think he wrote Ephesians either, that'd be really important because Ephesians gets used a lot by people who want to know what Paul really thought. Well, if it's written 20 or 30 years after Paul by somebody who was just claiming to be Paul, it doesn't represent necessarily what Paul thought.
Ephesians is a great example because it's got a lot of meaty Pauline substance in it, and yet it appears to have been composed after the war and the destruction of the temple. So that creates in the mind of many scholars this problem that, wait a minute, we want it to be Paul because it's got all this wonderful Pauline material, but on the other hand, it was probably written after Paul's time.
Yeah. Well, there have been scholars who have argued that Ephesians is the central Pauline letter. F.F. Bruce, who is this British scholar who wrote a book called Apostle of the Heart Set Free, which is an account of Paul, uses Ephesians as the core of Paul's writings. And it's understandable why, because whoever wrote Ephesians is bringing in all sorts of Paul's vocabulary and images and ideas and putting them together into this 6-chapter book. And but when you actually look at specifically what it says, what Paul allegedly says in this book, at almost every point there's something that's not at all like what Paul would have said. And so in my book, I might even do this in my book Forged for the general audience. I take a passage, I think it's chapter 2 verses 1 through 10, and show that even though this sounds like Paul, man, this is not Paul. When Ephesians says that you're saved by faith, not by works, he's talking about you're not saved by being a good person. You're saved by having faith. And that sounds Pauline until you actually read what Paul says. Paul says you're saved by faith, not by doing works of the law. Paul's not interested in whether you're saved by being a good person. He's interested in whether you have to be Jewish. Are you saved by the works of the law? And so you get these little things that end up being, whoa, that really is different, that you don't notice at first because it sounds like Paul.
Wow.
You mentioned in the book that there's a hypothesis about that some scholars go about with, and it's the idea that, well, we can explain the inconsistent theological views and grammar by the involvement of scribes. But in several of the letters of Paul, he frequently mentions that he wrote this letter with somebody else, like Paul and Timothy to the Corinthians, or Paul and Sosthenes to the Corinthians, or Paul, Silas, and Timothy in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. Do you think co-authorship is a possible explanation for some of these differences?
No, it's a good question, and it's really hard to answer. Some scholars tout this as being kind of the obvious answer as well. Some of these books are co-written, and others aren't. And so the ones that are implementing somebody else's writing style and theology and such. I looked into this at considerable length when I was doing research on my books, and I looked around to try and find any evidence of any kind of what co-authored works look like in the ancient world, because the assumption is that they'll be different from the single-authored books. And I couldn't find any evidence at all. I mean, we don't have, there's nothing to compare it to. In other words, it's not like you have writings, just take Seneca. I've been reading a lot of Seneca lately. And so take Seneca, if you got Seneca writing a letter, and suppose you had a book that's like co-authored, Seneca and someone else, and you knew that it was co-authored, and you knew that you had some of Seneca's work that was not co-authored, then you could compare them, right? And see, is it the same style, different style, same vocabulary? You could do that. You don't have a database though for Paul's, you don't have a database for any of these. You don't have that. You don't have that phenomenon that you can actually work it out. How different is it? And so in my book, I try to go into it a little bit further and ask, well, why in these books that claim to be written Paul and Sosthenes or Paul and whoever, why is it that in the middle of the once you get past the greeting, it's always the first person singular pronoun, I. In 1 Corinthians, it's Paul talking about himself. I. He starts off by saying he's co-authored, but then it's all I. It looks to me like what he's saying is that he's writing this and he's with these other people and they're kind of looking on, or they're maybe talking, but he's the one doing the writing. And these books that are allegedly co-authored, even in like 1 Corinthians and things, they're perfectly consistent in terms of the writing style and such with the ones that Paul wrote by himself. So I don't think it's a very strong argument. And if it were to be a strong argument, you'd have to find some kind of evidence that shows that this is that people's style and thinking and vocabulary changes when they have a co-authored book. I've never seen any evidence for that.
What about in 1 Corinthians, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 15, compared to what Paul says in Galatians, I think it's in chapter 1 or 2, in which he states in Galatians that he'd learned his theology from no man. He received it from revelation. But in 1 Corinthians, he learns it from men. So what do you think is going on there?
Yeah.
The big deal in the opening of Galatians, I got no
Huge.
man. I got this from my own revelation.
Huge.
But then elsewhere he says, I received this tradition. How do we square that?
Yeah. The question is, what is the antecedent of this? I got this. Well, these are two different books talking about, dealing with different issues, obviously. And so you have to ask, what's he talking about? In 1 Corinthians 15, he tells you what he's talking about. He's referring to the creed that shows up in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4, where he's learned this from others, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures and was buried. Christ was raised from the dead on the third day according to the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. He's heard that from other people. When he's talking in Galatians, what is he referring to? He's not referring to that. He's referring to what he calls his gospel, which in Galatians is the good news that salvation comes not just to Jews, but also to Gentiles without keeping the law. That's his distinctive spin on the salvation story, that Gentiles don't have to convert to Judaism. It's what the entire book of Galatians is about. And he says that if anybody teaches differently from this, everybody tells you have to be circumcised, they will be cursed by God. So here the issue is not whether Jesus died and was raised from the dead. Here the question is the gospel message that Paul preaches, that Gentiles can be saved without converting to Judaism.
But what a radical...
He's talking about different things.
He's
very
arguing,
radical. And
he's arguing with James and Cephas, confronting Cephas to his face, and James is spying out his freedom in Christ. So he appears to be condemning the previous followers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he says that they agree with him, but they're not really being very consistent. And but he goes after them. And apparently he says he and Peter had a falling out in public. It's interesting. He doesn't report who won the argument, or he thought he won the argument. He doesn't report like everybody sided with him, and so it may be that they didn't. But it's a very different context. And so what he's saying is that when he had his vision of Jesus is when he realized that Christ told him this applies to everybody. In 1 Corinthians 15, he's not talking necessarily about when he converted. He's just saying, I heard this. I think he surely heard about Christians saying that Christ died and was raised from the dead before he became a follower of Jesus himself. I mean, that's why he's persecuting these people.
And so by inference, we can say that previous Christians had visions of the risen Christ, but they were probably Torah orthodox. And Paul was the one who injected an element of Torah criticism into the movement.
I think so. I mean, I think, and I think that what Paul's doing is Paul's the one. I think Paul's the one who realizes that in fact being Jewish isn't the key. It's hard to know whether Paul objects to Jews maintaining the Jewishness. I don't think so. I think he thinks it's fine. You got these customs, keep your customs. That's fine. But to say the Gentiles have to follow them, that's wrong. And if you say that, you're cursed by God. So that part gets serious. But and he does, of course, he doesn't think that the law can provide salvation. The problem for Paul is that the law tells you how to behave. It just doesn't enable you to do it. You need the Spirit of God to do it. And for that, you got to believe in Christ.
I would like to circle back to the bishops and deacons and the pastoral epistles, but just before I do that, Clark Morledge is back with another super chat. Thanks again, Clark. When evangelical egalitarians say 1 Timothy 2:12 is about Ephesian women influenced by the Artemis cult, is this failed attempt to rescue Pauline authorship?
Whoa, I have to admit I don't have 1 Timothy 2:12 memorized, so I'm going to look it up here. I think it will sound familiar to all of us. Right. Is this the right verse? 1 Timothy 2:12. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over men. She's to keep silent. Is this a failed attempt to rescue Pauline? Ephesian women. Okay. So, no, I don't think that there's necessarily, well, 1 Timothy 2 doesn't mention anything about Ephesus. It doesn't mention anything about Artemis, and it doesn't mention anything about Pauline authorship. So I think the answer is probably no. That's not what this is about. My sense is that this is that notorious passage that I should have known if he'd given the whole thing. 1 Timothy 2 verses 12 through 15 is this notorious passage where the author, claiming to be Paul, tells women that they have to be silent in the churches. They're not to exercise any authority over a man because Adam was created first, not Eve. And Adam wasn't deceived. The woman was deceived, and then she misled the man. And so women can be saved if they bear children, but otherwise they have to be quiet in church. And so this author's dealing with an internal Christian situation where women are recognizing that that Paul had said that they're in Christ, there's no male or female, that women are equal with men in the church, and they're behaving like it. And this author, along with other men, didn't like that, and he points out that men cannot be instructed by women, because when women instruct men, it's always bad news. Going back to Adam and Eve, where Eve was deceived by the devil, not Adam, and she then misled the man. So what happens if you let women teach in the church? They'll be misled by the devil and they'll mislead the men. And so women can't teach in the church. So I don't think it has anything to do with the Artemis cult or necessarily Ephesus or anything like that.
Might it point to something earlier in Paul's circle where he mentions that he has women colleagues, and as you pointed out in Galatians, he says there's no free or slave, there's no male or female, and so maybe Paul had the original authentic Paul had a slightly different view about women, and the later pseudo-Pauline author wants to correct that impression.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there may be a correction in one of Paul's own letters as well. In 1 Corinthians, back to 1 Corinthians, in chapter 14, verses 33 and 34, you have a very similar line about how women are not supposed to be talking in church. They're getting problems, they let them ask their husbands at home kind of thing. And those two verses are thought by many scholars to be inserted into 1 Corinthians.
Well,
that they're not things that Paul wrote. So the deal is that this would be what we call an interpolation rather than a textual change. By interpolation, scholars mean a verse that's found in all the manuscripts, but it looks like the author didn't write it. We have instances of that in a few places in the New Testament, and this looks like it's probably one of those. The arguments are a lot harder to make for an instance like this than they are for saying, like for example, lots and lots of places. You've got like one manuscript says one thing, one says another thing, and you got to figure out which thing is the original thing. Well, there you got manuscripts saying different things, and so somebody's changed it. In this case, the burden of proof is a lot higher. If all the manuscripts have it, then you have to say, well, it got changed before any of our manuscripts got produced. Well, I mean, our first manuscripts of this passage are hundreds of years after the thing was written, but even so, it'd be pretty early. So you have to have a really high burden of proof. But this is one of, I think, maybe two places in the entire New Testament where I think probably it's right that this was interpolated, because the verses are really problematic.
Doesn't that verse in 1 Corinthians 14 that you just mentioned appear in different places in the same manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 14?
This is the very slim textual argument, is that they are in every manuscript, but in one part of the manuscript tradition, a small part of the manuscript tradition, they occur after verse 40 rather than where they normally occur. And so Gordon Fee, who is a very fine textual critic, and was not a liberal scholar at all. he was actually Pentecostal, and he'd go from a very serious, hardcore, scholarly academic meeting on the New Testament to go off and do a tent revival. Literally, he would. He was in both worlds. He wrote a commentary in 1 Corinthians where he argued that because these verses are relocated in a couple of the manuscripts, that shows that originally they may have been a marginal note by a scribe saying women are not supposed to teach in church, based in part on this thing in 1 Timothy, and that most scribes stuck it in one place and other scribes stuck it in a different place, and that would be used as kind of textual evidence that it might have not have been original. So for me, it was always really interesting because Gordon, who was a friend of mine, he passed away last year. He he was a very conservative Christian who argued that this passage against women in the church was not original. And there's another very fine scholar who argued, a feminist scholar who argued that in fact these verses were original. The feminist arguing. So I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. It's women prophetesses in Corinth. What's Bernadette Bruton. Bernadette Bruton argued that, who's also a fine scholar, argued they were original. You think it'd be the other way around, right? The feminists would say, yeah, they aren't original, but no, it's just the other way around. So,
It's the confirmation biases.
Maybe it shows that there's hope for scholarship, like you argue.
Fascinating.
Got another super chat. Welsh Backgammon, thank you for your super chat. To all of you, which non-extant New Testament era book would you most love to be really discovered? I think Letters to Paul would tell a fascinating story.
I'll start. I get asked this a lot, and I have so many options. It's like, what's your favorite movie? I mean, it's like, what's your favorite Beatles song? Oh my God, I've got 12 of them. So I would love to have Q. If it existed, I would love to have that.
Professor Goodacre would argue with us and say it didn't even exist.
I know. Me and Mark, and I could go over to Mark's house and say, "Hey, Mark, look at this."
Here's
Mark, as you know, Mark's my colleague at Duke, and so we're friends. And so I'd love to have that. I would love to have Marcion's antitheses. I would love to. I mean, there are a whole range of things I'd love to have. But the thing about letters, I would love to have letters to Paul. That would be great. But the other thing to point out that people haven't thought about very much is Paul must have written masses of letters that we don't have. I mean, just think about it. If Paul was converted, say he's converted around 33 or so, his ministry would have lasted about 30 years. He started right off the bat. And he had a lot of churches. I don't know how many churches he had, but he at least had 20 churches that he founded, probably more than that. And judging from how many times he appears to have written to Corinth and Philippi, and it appears that probably. So how many letters did he write? Suppose he just wrote two letters a year to each of his churches for 30 years. Well, if there are, say, 20 churches, 2 a year, it'd be 40 times 30. That's 1,200 letters. We have 7.
But even if there are only a quarter of those, there are hundreds of letters that are missing.
Oh, I think there must have been more than 20 churches. And there are hundreds and hundreds of letters missing. And, people didn't save them. They just thought they were letters. And so whoa, I'd like to find some of those.
Yeah. There are surely many, many more Pauline letters than we have.
Oh, gotta be.
And to Paul. Or how about an original first edition of Josephus's Antiquities?
Yeah. No, first editions would be nice of most of these things. I'd like to find a first edition of the Gospel of Luke. I don't think it had the first 2 chapters.
The Logos stuff seems pretty advanced philosophically.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of stuff that's there that doesn't seem like it fits. So, but that's another story. So,
But I like to circle back to the bishop
oh,
and
yeah.
deacons and the pastorals. Doesn't the beginning of doesn't the beginning of the Epistle to the Philippians? I know
Mhm.
that scholars think it's probably a composite letter. It's probably like 3 different letters that's been spliced into one.
Yeah.
Uh, but doesn't the beginning of it say something about deacons? And some
Yeah.
translations even go as far as saying bishops. Like,
It
what do
says
you think of
both.
that?
So
Yeah.
it's Paul's writing to the church in Philippi, and everybody thinks this is probably an authentic letter. And some people think Philippians is just one letter. It looks like it's got to be at least 2 and maybe 3 for complicated reasons. But um, but he starts off by saying that he's addressing it to the church in Philippi, and it's overseers and deacons, as it's translated sometimes, bishops and deacons. It's episcopoi and diakonoi. Uh, Episcopoi is where we get episcopal from. Episcopacy means one who looks over, and so the leader of the church is one who's looking over the church. So it becomes the word bishop. It's clear that Philippi had people that are called bishops and deacons. That's completely right. There's nothing to indicate that they have authority to solve the church's problems, or that they're given, that they're controlling the church or in charge of the church. So it's not clear what they're doing or who they are. When you get to the pastoral epistles, it's very different, because there the bishops are making the decisions in the church. There are regulations about who can be the bishop, who can't be bishops. Same with deacons. You got regulations. These are the people calling the shots. And so there's nothing like that in Philippians. So, but it's clear that there's something like, developed, kind of maybe a nucleus, something starting already by the time Paul writes Philippians.
Could this put Philippians at the later end of the dates of the authentic letters?
Yeah, might think so. Yeah, the thing with Philippians is that one reason for thinking that it's 2 letters is that it's part of the letter. Well, the tone changes rather radically in the middle of it, from being a letter of kind of joyful happiness with these people to being really kind of ticked off at them, and there's this. He talks about this companion of his named Epaphroditus that they were worried about, and that now who got very sick and almost died. Word got back to them, and then Paul found out they had gotten word, so he writes them to get back. And in part of this letter, it looks like there's been a lot of back and forths, and it doesn't really tie in well with the first part of the letter. So it looks like you got 2 letters, one earlier and one later. Yeah. So, but it's hard to know. It's hard to know how to date these things, really. Yeah. I have friends. I have friends who, like Mark Goodacre's friend over his colleague over at Duke. Richard. Sorry, it's been a long day already. Has written a book on Pauline chronology. So you have these people who write these Pauline chronologies, where they basically tell you where Paul was on April, 53, year 53, where he was in April. Not quite that detailed, but they very. Douglas Campbell is my longtime friend and colleague, but Douglas Campbell. And so I'm not a chronology guy, but I can tell you that the chronology stuff is really complicated when it comes to figuring out when Paul wrote what when.
Super chat. Evangelicals never lie. Thank you for your super chat. I don't have a question at the moment without going Old Testament. Just buying you guys a pizza. 3 great scholars unafraid to dissect all the biblical claims and contradictions. Well, thank you for your super chat.
Okay, well, for another 20 quid, throw in the Old Testament for us. We can do that.
Well, I'm deeply flattered that you would even say great scholars in the presence of Bart Ehrman and myself. I happen to admire Professor Ehrman very, very highly, and
Same here.
I wouldn't say that I was in his same category at all. As I was telling him before the interview, if you're a layperson not familiar with the details of these arguments, he's written some of the best introductions, probably the best introductions for someone who wants to understand these arguments and doesn't have the background, say, that professor at the Princeton Theological Seminary might have. Jesus Interrupted and this book Forged would be two books that I would highly recommend to people who are just getting into the subject and want to be introduced to the basic issues here. But I'm no Bart Ehrman, but thank you.
And you can be
Yeah.
glad
I
if you
second
knew
all
the rest of
that.
my life.
But thanks again for that super chat. Yeah, I want to circle back to Philippians again because I know that there's a minority group of scholars, very few scholars that are questioning the authenticity of Philippians. And I think it's because the beginning of it is one of the reasons, but I think there are other reasons that they are. I don't remember what they are precisely, but there are other reasons that they claim that they're having a little bit of issue with Philippians. Could you talk about that?
I'm not familiar with that. I mean, there are scholars who question everything. I have a former PhD student of mine named Ben White, who teaches at Clemson, has for a long time been working on a book that challenges the kind of criteria that are used to establish what's authentic and inauthentic in Paul. And he thinks that you can direct some of these arguments that are used, say, to show why First Timothy wasn't written by Paul, to show why some accepted letter wasn't written by Paul, and so it's never a done deal with scholarship. If there was a done deal with scholarship, nobody'd have anything to write about. And so one problem with that is that it means that any kind of thing that basically everybody agrees on, the way you make a name for yourself is to disagree with it. And then, get people on your side. And that's okay. I mean, it does mean though, like if you hang around the industry long enough, you just see the pendulum swinging back and forth, first they think this, then they think this. So when I was in graduate school, I mean, not so much with the Pauline letters, but when I was in graduate school, for example, just the common orthodoxy was that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not used by John. Just that's the common view. Everybody had that, and now like everybody's changing that view. So, okay, change the view.
Between Mark and John and Matthew and John is now right.
Yeah, that's right. And and the orthodoxy was always that the book of Acts was written in 80 or 85. And now there are a lot of scholars arguing, no, it was written in the year 120. And so, things change within scholarship, even when you're dealing with things 2,000 years old. That can be a healthy thing. It can also mean that you can just, now on the internet, you can just make up some crazy thing and write it out there and you'll have 1,000 people who agree with you just on principle.
But the truth is, though, that each one of these, although we were talking about a consensus, and with the pseudo-epigrapha, there is a pretty widespread consensus. But, once you dig into this, you can find that each one of these Pauline letters has proponents and opponents on each side.
That's right. Yeah. So we call the seven the undisputed Pauline letters, but it's a misnomer because what is undisputed in our world, and nothing's undisputed about Paul. So, I mean, I had a debate. Actually, I had a debate. Jacob, you may have heard this debate. I don't know, Jim, if you did, but I did this debate with Robert Price.
I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, and we had this debate about whether Jesus existed, and I was using one of the standard arguments that Paul knew his brother, and it's kind of hard to imagine Jesus not existing and his brother not knowing about it. You would think that's something his brother would know, and it's found in the book of Galatians. And Robert, on stage said, "Well, I don't think Paul wrote Galatians." And I just started laughing. I couldn't stop. I mean, it's very I shouldn't have done that. And I had to apologize to him later. I just thought, wow, okay, that's one way to deal with an argument. It's not that you reinterpret it to explain how Paul could mean brother, but not really mean like physical brother, but to say, well, Paul didn't write Galatians. That, that would take a lot of arguing. If you don't think Paul wrote Galatians, well,
right.
But, people think, people have ideas.
Well, it just seems to me, if I can just make a parenthetical comment here, it seems to me that the much stronger case for historical Jesus is, we have a crucifixion under Pilate, and unless I have a causal explanation for why someone would make up that fact, he was crucified under Pilate, or Paul surely believes in an earthly, he was born of a woman of the seed of David. I mean, stressing that he was an earthly person. And then you have Josephus confirming that there was this James figure talked about in Galatians who appears to be the brother of Jesus. When you put that together, it just seems to me that historicism has the much stronger argument.
I didn't even start hearing the word historicism until recently. It's like, historicism. It's like, there's a name for this? It's like, say, what? There's a name for what everybody thinks? Wait. It's like people who believe that there's an atmosphere. Is there a name for people who believe in an atmosphere? Oh, you're an atmospherist.
Who read books
I'm
like
a
yours,
what?
though. You have, but you have convinced many of my friends to whom I've recommended your books that there's a great deal of mythologizing going on in the
Yeah.
New Testament as well.
Yeah.
They've learned that from your books.
No, there's no doubt. Yeah, no, but the
So,
mythicists are saying that
Circle
Jesus,
up, you know?
to say that Jesus himself is a myth. I mean,
Right.
we have a lot of made up stories about Abraham Lincoln. Doesn't mean he didn't exist. I mean, man, we have made up stories about Barack Obama. They were made up while he was still in the White House. Stuff that he made up, and it's like, what So the fact that you have made up stories doesn't mean he didn't exist. I mean, to their discomfort, he did exist. So I think you have to differentiate between the questions of whether you have lots of legendary material versus
Right.
did the guy exist or not? Yeah,
Right.
he existed.
Different.
I want to get into Simon Magus because in Forged, you mentioned that in the Clementine homilies, the Clementine romances, it seemed to you that Simon Magus is basically a repurposing of Paul, because Simon Magus is mirroring Paul's argument with Peter, and the name Simon Magus is a double of Simon Peter. So do you think that the Clementine tradition is taking the Simon Magus from Acts and then rewriting the character to mirror Paul?
Yeah, there's this dude who's arguing with Simon Peter, and could it be that Simon Magus is becoming the alter ego of Paul and being the heavy in that argument in the Clementine recognitions?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there are a lot of debates about. I mean, there are not a lot of debates about the pseudo Clementines because there's not a lot of people study them, but there are debates about the Simon Magus figure in the pseudo Clementines. For people who don't know, you've mentioned the recognitions and the homilies. These are two long books, narratives that are focused on Clement of Rome. This figure I mentioned earlier, the book of First Clement, was allegedly written by this person, and so Clement of Rome was one of the early bishops of Rome, depending on how you count, the third or the fourth bishop of Rome. Bishops of Rome, of course, later came to be known as the Pope, and so this would be one of the early popes, living at the end of the first century. And after his death, there started circulating stories about him that he had been converted by the Apostle Peter, and that he had accompanied Peter on many of his trips. And so the pseudo Clementines are the homilies and the recognitions, as they're called, are two versions of an older story about the relationship of Peter and Clement. And it's a lot of it is about Peter's life and ministry as Clement observes it, traveling with him. And one of the figures in these adventures is Simon Magus, this figure named in the book of Acts. The word Magus, people are familiar with the word magi, the wise men. Magus is the singular of that. And it's related to our word magician. They're usually understood to be people who are astrologers, for example, people who kind of study magic. And so Simon Magus in the book of Acts wants to acquire the power of the apostles and is willing to pay them for it. And they're offended by this, as if you can get the Spirit of God by shelling out. And so he's portrayed as kind of an opponent of the apostles. After the New Testament period, he becomes a figure who's thought of as an apostolic opponent, especially an opponent of Peter. And so in the pseudo Clementines, he is an opponent. And in other Petrine books, such as the Acts of Peter, which is not related to the pseudo-Clementines. The question in the pseudo-Clementines has been, the thing that's debated is whether Simon Magus is being portrayed as a Paul figure, whether he's using it as a nickname for Paul or attributing Paul's ideas and views to Simon Magus. And that it may be right. I occasionally think so. Apparently, when I wrote my book, I thought so. I don't remember just now. But the thing is that Peter's enemy in the Pseudo-Clementines in another place clearly is Paul. It's not in the recognitions or the homilies. There's a letter, again, allegedly written by Peter. So it's a forgery. Nobody thinks this one's authentic either. So in addition to 1st and 2nd Peter in the New Testament, you get one in the Pseudo-Clementines, the beginning of the homilies, which is sent to James, the brother of Jesus, the head of the church in Jerusalem. And in this letter, Peter says that he wants James to protect his teachings because people are going to change them and corrupt them, and he wants to make sure that he protects them, and he only gives his writings to people that he can trust because he doesn't want people to manipulate these things. And then he speaks about people who are his enemies, and he names one in particular. Doesn't name him. He says that some people are saying that he, Peter, preaches a lawless gospel to the Gentiles. So a Christian preaching to the Gentiles that does not involve the law. That sounds like Paul. And Peter says, the person who does this man is my enemy. Whoa. And so there it's pretty clearly that Paul's the enemy, but he's not named. And so this was a book written by somebody who had the idea that Christianity is to remain a Jewish phenomenon, that followers of Jesus are to keep the Jewish law, and you get aspects of that throughout these long books of the Pseudo-Clementines. And so the question is whether Simon Magus is to be the Pauline figure or not. Some people think so. Other people think that, in fact, Simon Magus is just the cipher for anybody who's an enemy of the truth, and not particularly Paul.
When you look at these different traditions, like the correspondence between the brief correspondence between Peter and James and the Clementine tradition, or the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, all these fake biographies, fake letters are going around. Are these different Christian communities that are trying to backdate their specific theology to these New Testament figures?
That's a good question. So in terms of these particular books, some of them are forgeries, where they're claiming to be, someone they're not. The Apocalypse of Peter. We actually have 3 Apocalypses of Peter, as it turns out. One of them nobody reads because it's in Arabic and it's much later. But there's one that's in Greek and there's one that's in Coptic, and the Greek one almost made it into the New Testament. There were debates about it into the 4th century about whether it should be included in Scripture by people who thought Peter really wrote it, and it claims to be written by Peter. Peter absolutely did not write it. It had to be written about 70 years or so, 80 years after Peter had died. We have reasons for knowing that. But then we also have a Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. Jim, you mentioned the Nag Hammadi Library. This is this Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter that's really, really interesting and really weird, well, okay, we can talk about it later if we want to. Anyway, so you have these books claim to be written by Peter, but other ones like the Acts of Peter the Acts of Peter does not claim to be written by Peter. So it would be like a fabrication of stories, but it wouldn't be what I'm calling a forgery. Okay. In both cases, you are having authors who are trying to show that the views that they hold were views that were held back in the apostolic times, specifically by Peter. And so what you have is, I like the term you use, backdating. A part of it is they are backdating the tradition, their views back into the earliest period. And they're also using apostolic authority so that Peter stands behind these views. That's why you have so many books connected with Peter, is because he was Jesus' right-hand man. And so naturally, if you've got some view that you want to authorize, you claim Peter wrote the book. And so there's a very close relationship between author and authority. The author provides authority to the book, and so that's why they want to make these claims.
What do you make of the infancy narrative of James?
Oh, I think it's great. I love it. And so it goes by different titles. The earliest title is just called the Book of James, as it turns out. But eventually, it got a lot of titles over the centuries. When it was first published in Latin, I don't know, the 18th century, it was the preface, everything else was in Latin, and it was called, in other words, the person who did this edition, but he called it the Protevangelium Jacobi, which is the proto gospel of James. And it was called a proto gospel because most of its action takes place before the gospel stories of the New Testament. It's really more about why Mary was chosen to be the one to bear the Son of God. And so it's about Mary's miraculous birth, not by a virgin, but she has a miraculous birth. And and it tells her story about how she ends up getting pregnant and how, and her and Joseph, and why Joseph gets selected to be her husband as an old man. And it's a terrific, terrific story that includes some very bizarre scenes. My favorite of which is Mary. So in timeout. So in the New Testament, you actually do not have a virgin birth. What you have in the New Testament is a virginal conception. Mary is a virgin when she conceives, but there's nothing about whether she's a virgin at birth. In the ancient world, when a woman gave birth, not just in the ancient world, in the modern world too, a woman's hymen breaks. And in the ancient world, a virgin birth would be if the woman was still intact after giving birth. So she'd be virginally conceived, but also the child would be virginally born. There's nothing in the New Testament about Mary's physical state after Jesus' birth, but there is in the proto-gospel of James. Joseph has gone off to find a midwife. They're getting near Bethlehem on their trip, and Mary goes into labor, and he has to find someplace to, so she could do it in private. And he finds his cave. He takes her into this cave, and he leaves her with one of his adult sons to watch over. And he runs off to find a midwife because he doesn't want to deliver this thing. And so he runs off and gets a midwife, finds a midwife, brings the midwife back, and says, she says, "Is this your wife in this cave?" No, she's Mary, but she got pregnant by the Holy Spirit. What? No, I don't believe that. And he said, "No, really, she got pregnant by the Holy Spirit."
Oh, really?
So trust me. And so they go back. So they go back to the cave, and the cave is shining so brightly they can't even see inside of it. And then the brightness disappears and the cloud dissipates, and they can see into the cave. There's Mary, and there's the baby who walks over to her and takes her breast and starts nursing. And so the midwife says, "Oh my God, it is a miracle." She runs off and finds a friend, and her friend is named Salome. And she finds a friend who's apparently also a midwife. And she says, "Salome, you won't believe this. A virgin is given birth." Salome says, "I'm not going to believe it." "No, really?" Salome says, "I won't believe it unless I give her an internal exam." And so, okay. And so they go back to the cave, and the midwife says to Mary, "Okay, brace yourself. There's some controversy here." And Salome gives her an internal exam and realizes, oh my God, she is a virgin. And then, because she's disbelieved the miracle, her hand starts burning, and she prays to God to heal her hand. And God tells her to pick up the child. And she picks up the infant Jesus, and so it's his first miracle. He heals her hand. Man, you wish this one made it into the New Testament. but it is definitely so. The text as we have it claims to be written by James, which would be James, the brother of Jesus, and it absolutely was not written by James, the brother of Jesus. So. Yeah. So if that claim goes back to the original version of this, then it would be another forgery.
Does it seem to you that this proto-evangelion of James is trying to build on the virginal conception of Jesus that we see in the New Testament, as basically elaborating on it further?
Yeah, what happens is that it gets elaborated in a lot of ways. The idea that Jesus was conceived of a virgin. In the account of the virginal conception is found only in Matthew and Luke in the New Testament. So it's not mentioned in the other two Gospels, and it's not mentioned in Paul or anywhere else. And so it obviously wasn't a huge doctrine for the earliest Christians, even though it became a huge doctrine later. But and Matthew and Luke have Jesus conceived of a virgin for two different reasons. In Matthew, it's to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14. That's why he has to be conceived of a virgin, because Isaiah predicted it. In Luke, he has to be conceived of a virgin because he really is the Son of God. And so God got her pregnant. And so it's more of a literal. He really is the Son of God because of this. And that's all you hear about anything about virginal conception or birth or anything like that in the New Testament. Eventually, people started expanding this idea. One expansion was what we just saw, is that not only did Mary conceive as a virgin, she gave birth as a virgin. They eventually developed the idea that she was perpetually a virgin. In the New Testament, Jesus is said to have brothers and sisters, but in several passages. But the idea developed that, in fact, Mary never had sex. And so that's why you start having claims that James and the other brothers aren't actual brothers. They're children of Joseph from a previous marriage. That's what you get in the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, that these are Joseph's adult children. But then also later, by the time you get to Jerome, which I think, Jim, you mentioned earlier, Jerome thought that, Mary, of course, didn't have sex. She was pure her whole life, so she couldn't have sex. But Joseph was a saint too. He couldn't have had sex either. That means these cannot be children of a previous marriage, because Joseph never would have had sex. He's a saint. And so he developed the idea that is still the most popular idea in Catholic circles, that these brothers are actually cousins. That they're not brothers, they're cousins. But one other thing I have to say, because everybody gets this one wrong, which is that the other concept related to this is the Immaculate Conception.
Well, that's Mary, right?
That's Mary. This is when Protestants get wrong. Protestants think that's just the virgin birth, right? No, it ain't the virgin birth. And it's not, the Immaculate Conception is not found in the Proto-Evangelium. It develops later. But the idea with the Immaculate Conception is not that her mother was a virgin. Her mother, Anna, was not a virgin. She's been having sex for a long time and trying to have a baby. What happens in the Immaculate Conception is that God works a miracle. That when Anna conceives, the child that is born of her does not inherit her sin nature. So Mary is not born with a sin nature. That's important, because even if Joseph isn't the father, if Mary's the mother, she'll pass on the sin nature to Jesus. But Jesus can't have a sin nature, so Mary can't have one. So she's immaculately conceived. It's through sex, but she's not given the sin nature. And so these are four different things: the virginal conception, the virgin birth, the perpetual virginity, and the Immaculate Conception. And Protestants have a heck of a time with that.
These ideas seem to have taken time to have developed.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't really, known to Paul or his generation. These developed slowly over the next couple of 2, 3, 4 centuries, these ideas.
Yeah. Well, Paul doesn't even seem to know about a virginal conception. I mean, he says, the only time Paul mentions Jesus' birth is this strange passage. One of you mentioned it. I think, Jim, maybe you mentioned it a second ago, Galatians 4 forward. Paul says that Jesus was born of a woman. Like, born of a woman? What option does he have exactly? What do you mean, born of a woman? What? Why are you saying this? So that's an interesting question. But he doesn't say born of a virgin, for example, or anything. So it's not clear at all that Paul knew anything about a virgin birth. And you're right, Jim. I mean, these ideas develop over time as theology develops.
Well, similarly, Paul says Jesus was buried, but he doesn't make any hoopla about an empty tomb. Whereas as the Gospels develop, it appears that the resurrection stories get more and more and more complex and advanced, and they're more and more and more stressing the physical resurrection and the empty tomb.
That's right, and so Paul, you're right. Paul mentions visions that people saw Jesus, according to Paul. He himself did, but nothing about an empty tomb. We'd get to the Gospels. The interesting thing is the earliest Gospel has an empty tomb, but no appearances of Jesus. In Mark, Jesus is raised from the dead, but nobody sees him.
And they just went away afraid at the end of
the women don't tell anybody.
Just don't tell, right?
That's helpful.
That's helpful.
Thanks.
It's as if they're explaining why it wasn't widely known at first.
Yeah, probably so. And it's, it's too bad because look, you could have started Christianity if you just tell somebody.
Good
What are they
point.
thinking?
What do you make of the other forgery, the Gospel of Peter in particular? I know that some scholars, not many, but mainly John Dominic Crossan tries to suggest that the Gospel of Peter goes back, not the Gospel itself, but a source, the cross Gospel, he calls it.
Yeah.
And I did a video with him about that
Hmm.
last year.
Hmm.
And he thinks that this cross Gospel is a source for the Synoptic Gospels and also the Gospel of John, and that it provided information to all four of them, including to Peter's Gospel. What do you make of that?
So Dom Crossan is a really, really smart guy and very interesting, and he knows everything. He's great. And so I used to like it when I would be interviewed for a television program and they would also interview Dom, because then when they show me saying something, Dom saying something, I seem so conservative. Like, I'm not radical at all. Listen to that guy.
For the contrast.
So Dom has this very, very large book, The Cross That Spoke, that makes this argument. And you're right, he does not argue that the Gospel of Peter is prior to the other Gospels, but he thinks that Peter and the others are all based on something that he calls the Cross Gospel, and that Peter represents it better than the others, so that in effect, if you want the earliest source, you have to analyze the source of the Gospel of Peter. When Dom has made a career out of arguing that sources that most scholars date later are earlier. He early dates sources that most scholars think are later, and he kind of needs to do that because his portrayal of Jesus is a portrayal of Jesus not found in our earliest sources. And so one way around that is to predate other sources. And so, for example, you might predate what's going on in the Gospel of Thomas before what you find in the Gospel of Mark. And if you say, well, Thomas was written before, or the basic stuff was before, then, okay, you solve the problem. Part of the problem is that our earliest sources, if you divide up the sources of the synoptics, you have Mark and you have this Q source that if it existed, that most people still think existed, that was used by Matthew and Luke. And Matthew had his own sources; they call him L, and Luke has his own sources, call him L. M and L. So you have Mark, Q, M, and L, and then you got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You got all these things. So what is that? 7. You got 7 of these things that are interrelated in various ways, but also independent in various ways. And all of them, if you want to know whether Jesus was preaching an apocalyptic message, all of these sources say so. So if you don't think Jesus was an apocalypticist, you better redate some sources because otherwise you're burned. And so I don't think that so the cross gospel is kind of different though, because it's not the preaching of Jesus. It's an account of the trial and death and resurrection of Jesus. It is a very clever argument that he makes, and I've never found it convincing. And there really aren't very many scholars that I know of who have. I know that Paul Marecki found it convincing, and I'm sure there are others, but I just don't know of them. It takes a whole lot, because the Gospel of Peter is in most people's opinion knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and seems to cite each one of them, and the distinctive elements of the Gospel of Peter are it's heightened anti-Judaism, which is much more stressed even than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is saying something. So the 2 points are it's heightened anti-Judaism and it's heightened Jesus. Jesus, remember, this is the one Jesus comes out of the tomb as tall as a mountain, right? And the cross comes behind him, and the voice asks, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And the cross says, "Yes." That's clearly, of course, the Gospels have legendary stuff, but this is beyond anything you get in the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. That's usually thought to be an indication that it's later, as is the heightened Judaism, as the apparent use of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I don't find that part convincing.
How do you respond when you point out that much of this early Christian literature does appear on the face of it to be forged, to be claiming to be written by someone it almost certainly was not written by? People have responded to me, well, that sounds conspiracy theory like. Oh, you're
Mm.
claiming that this person made this all up, this person made that all up. How would you respond to the conspiracy theory response to claiming that much of this literature is forged?
Well, that's interesting. I have never in my life, I know, I've been accused of being a conspiracist. I am so
But it sounds
somebody.
like intentional fraud.
Yeah, no,
And
I get it. I get it. Yeah, no, I have
some,
a rabbi between just this afternoon. I got a cartoon from a rabbi friend of mine that was a minister preaching at a funeral service, and the fellow's laid out in the casket in front of him, and he's up in his pulpit preaching. He says, "So now we have, now brothers and sisters, we have one less conspiracy theorist in the world." Then he says, "Or do we?"
or
So, yeah. So boy, I tell you, I am not a conspiracy theory guy. Conspiracy theories drive me
would you
crazy. So
distinguish and
yeah,
say even
yeah,
an overt intentional
yeah.
fraud from a wahaha conspiracy in the smoke
Well,
filled?
what I'd say is that I try to be a historian, and I don't try to go with whatever view seems like sexy and weird and able to get big following, and that requires belief without evidence. So I'm very much into evidence, and I think that wherever the evidence goes, I'm willing to go. With the New Testament, I mean, in particular, I'm not a Christian. I don't have any personal vested interest in whether Paul wrote Second Timothy or not. I mean, that'd be, if he did, that'd be great. It'd mean we'd have to reconsider like what Paul really thought. But it's not, so I don't have I don't have any really ulterior motives in terms of trying to disprove or prove anything. And the kind of things that I talk about in my book Forged, um, virtually all of that is stuff that I could have heard at Princeton Theological Seminary, training to be a Presbyterian minister. People certainly thought that there were only 7 letters that Paul wrote. When I took my introduction to the New Testament class, taught by a New Testament theologian, when he gave, I was an evangelical Christian at the time. When he gave his lecture on Ephesians, he spent the entire time talking about how Ephesians had completely corrupted Paul's theology. And so it wasn't just that it wasn't written by Paul. It was like it was a travesty of the Christian tradition. This was a New Testament theologian. So this is just, and he wasn't a conspiracy theorist. I think it's pretty easy just to label that chart. I think what you do is you just ask people and look at the evidence. And if you don't think so, that's fine. But you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist when you realize that there are lots of forgeries in early Christianity that nobody doubts. And so to say that, First Peter's one of them isn't particularly crazy. I mean, it's just, you have to look to see if it is.
Right. And the evidence, if we're scientific historians, the evidence is what should lead us there.
You look at evidence. You don't just, make wild claims that have no basis so that somebody will believe you.
Yes, sir.
I want to shift to the Epistle of James. And there are different scholars that take different positions on how to look at that. James, the letter of James does not outright claim it was written by Jesus' brother, but it just says it was written by somebody called James. Now, some interpret it as saying, well, it's kind of hinting that it was written by Jesus' brother without outright saying it. Others will say, well, it's just a different James. And others will say, it's a forgery because it's claiming to be written by James. And then others will say, it is partly authentic, but it's also partly forged.
Well, part of the argument is based, if I could just add a little to the question.
Sure.
In Paul's argument in Galatians with James and Cephas, it does seem to be over the role of the law. And in the epistle ascribed to James, it seems to stress that we can't vary from the law at all. And so there seem to be thematic reasons to associate it with the James of Galatians, although James was a really common name among, especially in this period, if our sources are any indication, among Jews in the Roman period. So it's an extremely common name. We have multiple Jameses associated with Christianity. It's just that there's this thematic association. Now, I know there's a lot of criticism about the include. I mean, Martin Luther thought that the Epistle of James shouldn't even be included. So there's been a bunch of controversy about that. But what's your take on that?
These are all really good and I think very, very serious and important points. The issue with so both of the points you just raised, Jim, about the name and the clear kind of Pauline, anti-Pauline allusions are important, I think. The first thing to say is that James, you're right, James was a very common name. And this is what makes it suspicious in this case. Because normally, if you have a common name, you identify which one you are. So which James are you? You give some kind of indication, unless the audience knows perfectly well who you are, but he's not writing to a local church. He's writing to the 12 tribes of Israel, he says, and which means that he's writing to people dispersed throughout the world. And so he's not writing a specific letter to a specific group, but he doesn't indicate why. He just calls himself James. And that's
Right.
normally taken to mean that he means he's that James, that he wants you to think he's that James. And that sounds plausible to me. Nobody would think he's James, the disciple of Jesus, for example, because that person, in the tradition at least, was martyred early. And so
Right.
he wouldn't be alive. And
Right.
so there aren't any other Jameses who were kind of, so I think he's probably claiming to be that James. But then the question is, well, but it does sound like maybe it's kind of related to this controversy in Galatia. And I would say that it absolutely is related to it, because I think this is an author who wants to take on the views of the Pauline tradition, and that in fact he appears to be familiar with Galatians. There are passages where it's quite clear if he's not familiar with Galatians, he's familiar with the argument of Galatians, whether it comes from Galatians or not. But they both use. So Paul wants to say that a person is justified by faith without doing any works of the law. James wants to argue that a person is justified by faith, by works, not by faith alone. That sounds like the opposite. Martin Luther thought it was the opposite. Martin Luther said that, if somebody can reconcile these two, he'll eat his hat. He'll take off his hat and eat it. So they seem to be, and so they argue the opposite, but they both use Abraham as the example to prove their view, and they both quote Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, to prove whether it's faith or works. And so this author knows something about either Galatians or about how Paul was arguing. But this is the curveball that I threw in when I wrote my books, which is that as I had studied this, I wasn't sure going in when I started doing serious research on this stuff back in the mid 2007 or something. I wasn't sure about the book of James. I thought maybe, I didn't think it was written by the brother of Jesus, but I thought that maybe it's just some guy named James. I had a fairly open mind about it, but then I looked into it. And one thing that really struck me as interesting is that I hadn't realized before. When James and Paul talk about whether a person's saved by faith or works, James means something very different by both faith and works from what Paul means. And this, for me, was a key. When Paul uses the word faith, he's referring to a relationship of trust. I've said this earlier, that you trust Christ's death for your salvation. You trust that God will fulfill his promises. It's a trust. In James, faith isn't trust. Faith is what you know. And you can see this in the passage in chapter 2 where James says that, faith isn't enough. Even the demons believe.
Believe.
It's the same word as the faith. It's the pistis word, the pistuo. Even the demons believe and shudder. And so they believe. It doesn't mean they trust God. It means they have the knowledge. They know there's only one God, but, it doesn't do them any good. And so that's what faith means for him. It means an intellectual assent to a proposition, which is what many people say today. Yeah, I don't believe that. It means you don't agree with the proposition. Let me clarify for people who don't understand this. The word faith in English and the word believe and belief in English are both translating the same Greek word. In Greek, pistis is faith and pistuo is believe. just comes into English as different words because we have a noun for faith, but we don't have a verb for faith. You can't faith something. And so they have to use believe and faith, but it's the same word. So faith is different in James and Paul, but also the more interesting thing, this is the one I really didn't realize before, is that when James is talking about works, he's talking about being a good person, doing good things.
Not the law of Moses letter.
Not the law of Moses.
Okay.
Not the works of the law.
Got it.
Paul attacks the works of the law, thinking the works of the law matter for salvation. James attacks doing good things, not doing good things for salvation. Well, if he's really talking about Paul, he's talking about a straw man, because Paul would never deny you're going to do good things.
Yeah, he lists vices and virtues. He wants us to
my God. A third, in each of his letters, somewhere between a half and a third are all about how you have to behave ethically. So, but this is not contrary to Paul.
Right.
But it is contrary to the letter to the Ephesians. Because in the letter to the Ephesians, I said there are things that are different in Ephesians from Paul. This works business, I think I mentioned this. In Paul, it's doing the works of the Jewish law. In Ephesians, it's being a good person won't save you. James is arguing against the view of Ephesians. And so that's why in my book, I call James a counter forgery. And I mean something technical by that. It's a forgery that's directed against a forgery. So Ephesians is a forgery, which I try to show, and James is countering this forgery of Ephesians.
A battle of the forgeries.
Yeah, right.
Fascinating.
I like to shift to the 3 epistles of John. And I know that some scholars will put them in a different order because some think that 2nd John or even 3rd John is earlier than 1st John. What do you make about these 3 letters of John? Were any of them written by the same person that wrote the Gospel of John, or different author, or were the 3 letters of John written by the same person or different persons?
Let me tell you what I've thought for the last 20 years, and then tell you what my colleague is trying to convince me of, because it's relevant to the forgery issue. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are arranged in the New Testament according to length. They are usually thought to have been written in that sequence, but there's no reason they had to be. They're just lined up by length. It has, my view for a long time was that whoever wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John was part of the community of the author who wrote the Gospel of John, but a different person, who was influenced by that theology, a very similar theology, but confronting a different situation that accrued later in the history of the church, the Johannine community. So that my view was that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John written by the same person, but somebody who has similarities to the author of John, but not the same person. And I had reason for thinking that's been a standard view for a long time. There are lots of views, as you pointed out. You could say they're all 3 written by different. You could say 2 of them are written by the same. One's different. All views are possible. So I have a colleague at UNC Chapel Hill named Hugo Mendez, who is a New Testament scholar. He's a very erudite and wide-ranging scholar. He's early in his career. He's just published his first book with Oxford, which is not on the New Testament. It's on the development of the cult of Stephen in Jerusalem in the 4th and 5th centuries. So Stephen cult, and Stephen became the kind of the local, the patron saint, the patron martyr of Jerusalem. And he traces that. And so he wasn't even dealing, and his PhD, by the way, is in linguistics, having nothing to do with the New Testament. And so his PhD in linguistics, he writes this book on Stephen in the 5th century. And now he's writing this book on the Johannine literature. And he has a startling argument. He argues, I just interviewed him on my podcast, by the way. I have a podcast called the Misquoting Jesus podcast. I just interviewed Hugo because this is so interesting. My interview with him was on whether the Gospel of John is a forgery. I've always said no. Gospel of John doesn't claim to be written by John. It's not a forgery. You can't forge something if you don't say what your name is. Hugo argues it's a forgery. he means by that whoever wrote John is claiming in his judgment, by his interpretation, is claiming to be Jesus' close disciple, the beloved disciple, that he's claiming that, and he wasn't the close disciple, wasn't the beloved disciple, and so it's a forgery. But he goes beyond that. He thinks that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were written by 2 or 3 authors, and that 1st John is a forgery by somebody who wants you to think that he's the author of the Gospel of John, and that 2nd John is forgery wanting you to think that he's the author of 1st John, and 3rd John is a forgery claiming he wants you to be the author of 1st and 2nd John, and it's a string of forgeries, and that it's a forging tradition. And man, he's got evidence for this. It's like, whoa, I like for the first 3 or 4 years we're talking about this. Yeah, no, that ain't it just ain't right. Come on, you get over it. And boy, the more I think about it, I think he might be onto something here. And so that's his next book.
Can't wait.
Yeah,
sounds a brilliant guy too.
He's brilliant. Yeah, he's great.
Oh, can't wait for it.
I like to shift to Luke Acts because you mentioned that. Okay, you have this scholar here that is arguing that John actually is a forgery. Well, what about Luke Acts? Because in the other half of Acts, it talks about the we document, or what is called the we sections of Acts. And you've stated publicly that you think the author of Luke Acts forged that, or made that up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you used the word forge, but you said
no, I do.
I called,
yeah, I think it's a forgery. I mean,
okay,
I call it I have a weird word for it, just to make everybody look askance at me. I call it I think I call it a non-pseudonymous forgery. So non-pseudonymous, by that I mean the author doesn't name himself. So he doesn't put a pseudonym on the work, but he's trying to make you think that he is somebody other than who he is. That would be what Hugo's saying about the Gospel of John. John doesn't claim to be anybody in particular, but he's trying to make you think that so he doesn't put his name on it. So it doesn't have a false name on it. So with Luke, there's nothing in Luke itself to make you think it's that the author's claiming to be anybody in particular, in my view. The book of Acts is making an authorial claim. You have these 4 passages that are the we passages, as you said. They start in chapter 16, where the author is talking about Paul and his companions on their missionary journeys, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, breaks into the first person plural pronoun, we. Then we did this, we did that. So it's Paul and his companions, Paul is doing this, Paul is doing that, and Paul and his companions doing that. Then we went to, then all of a sudden, we for a while. And then it breaks off like in the middle of nowhere.
Without any explanation of putting the author into the story. It just goes from
just starts to we.
Objective narrative to a first-person direct narrative without any signaling of it.
No transition. Nothing like, then I joined up with them and we. No, it's just like we. And it ends that way and then begins again. It does it 4 times. And so what I used to think, and that I taught for many years, is that the author of Acts, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, had a number of sources at his disposal. When he wrote the Gospel of Luke, he had Mark, he had Q, he had L, he had sources.
Luke, he tells Theophilus that he refers to earlier sources.
He says that many people have written these accounts and that he wants to write a reliable one, he says. And so, okay. And then it begins Acts a similar way. Theophilus, in my earlier book, I talked about what Jesus said and did. And so he links the 2 together. But in Acts, then all of a sudden, halfway through it, he starts using this we stuff. And it's clear. So what I used to argue was that just as he used sources for Luke, he used sources for Acts, and that one of his sources was a travel itinerary. That he had a diary that somebody had kept, on a partial fragmentary diary that he inserted into his account at the appropriate places. And that's still, I think, a possibility, but I don't think so anymore. Again, as I started digging deep into the research, I came to realize that this is a common ploy among forgers to not to make a big deal of it, not to claim that you are Peter, that like in 2 Peter, where Peter says, his name is Peter, and that he was on the Mount of Transfiguration, he heard the voice, and so he's not making stuff up, he's going on, the voice on the Mount of Transfiguration, so he's like really going after it to make you think, oh man, it must be Peter. And Acts isn't like that. It's very subtle. He says we a few times, but it's it's with Paul. And so he's claiming to be a travel companion of Paul. Well, who better to know about Paul's life and teachings than a travel companion? And so it's a very subtle way to do a forgery. The response that I get all the time from people who don't believe it say, look, if he wanted to be a forger, he wouldn't be that subtle. He'd come out and say it. I mean, you can't be subtle and get away. I mean, how would you? And my response is, are you kidding me? He would be more effective if he did it differently. How effective can you be? For 2,000 years, people have said this was Luke Paul's traveling companion. That's how successful he was. I mean, what more could he do to make somebody think he's a traveling companion? And so it's brilliant. So some people are more subtle than others. But I do think that
it's more persuasive than simply saying from Paul to someone. It's far more effective to say, and then we.
Yeah, because then you just assume it. You don't have to
I see.
Ask, you just, well, okay, yeah, so he's with them now. Okay, yeah. So
yeah, way more powerful because you're giving eyewitness substance to your being a companion of Paul, as opposed to simply saying, I am Paul, and this is, from Paul to so-and-so.
And yeah. So anyway, that I don't know if Jacob, that answers your question, but I do think that I think it acts as a
really good answer, Professor Ehrman.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm gonna go back to what you were saying earlier about you think that the first 2 chapters of Luke are absent from the original version, probably were absent from the original version of the gospel. Do we have manuscripts of it where those 2 are missing, or is there more of a language reason why you think those 2 chapters were not there?
No, we absolutely have no manuscripts. No, this is a argument that's on other grounds. I'm not the first to make this argument. Of course, it's been around for a long time. There are lots of reasons for thinking that these 2 chapters did not originally belong to Luke. I didn't really dig into this much until I started writing many, many years ago. I wrote a book called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And I was trying to deal with how scribes had changed their texts when they copied them in places to make their texts more orthodox so that they couldn't be used by heretics. And I wasn't arguing that Luke 1 and 2 were added onto the book, but I was dealing with this passage in chapter 3 where Jesus is baptized and the voice comes from heaven. And I was arguing that there's a manuscript divide there. And I was arguing that the oldest reading, probably the original reading, was the reading that said, the voice comes from heaven and says, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Okay, so Jesus becomes God's son at his baptism. But then I thought, well, how's that work in a book that has the virgin birth?
Which is told about his birth.
2 chapters earlier. And so I started thinking, and I started reading around. I realized there's a dispute about this. And I realized, there's some really interesting things about these first 2 chapters. So I'll list some of the interesting things. One thing is, if you just start with chapter 3, verse 1, you start there, ignore the first 2, just start with 3:1. It sure sounds like the beginning of a book. The author begins by saying, this took place in the days of Herod during the reign of Caesar Augustus, and he gives a dating, which normally that's how you begin a book. You date, when the events are going to happen, but it happens in 3:1. Not only that, but when in chapter 3, when Luke gives a genealogy of Jesus. So Matthew has a genealogy. Luke has a genealogy. Matthew has it where you'd expect a genealogy when Jesus is born, right? The book begins with, these are the generations, and it gives Jesus genealogy. Luke gives Jesus genealogy after the baptism. What? Why would you give a genealogy after the baptism? And it's right after the verse said, "You're my son, today I have begotten you." And the genealogy in Luke doesn't go back to Abraham like in Matthew. And it goes all the way back to Adam, right, who's the son of God. And so Jesus is the son of God by genealogy and by baptism. And so, but why would you put a genealogy after the baptism? Well, because that's where the gospel started. It starts. So you have those 2 things, but then you have the fact that the first 2 chapters are written in a very different writing style that people have long noticed. That the writing style, if you just look at the writing style of chapters 1 and 2, is very much like the Septuagint. It's like the Greek Old Testament, and the rest of Luke is not. Not only that, you don't have a reference to the major events in chapters 1 and 2 anywhere else in either Luke or Acts. The virgin birth, the birth of John the Baptist, the Annunciation, just kind of go down the list of what's in chapters 1 and 2. It's never mentioned anywhere else. Even in Acts, written by the same person who's summarizing what happened earlier in the book of Luke. You start adding all this stuff up, and there are other arguments. You start adding it up, you think, man, I don't think this thing originally had 1 and 2. And then you have to figure out, well, why would somebody add 1 and 2? And that's where it gets interesting. I've already gone too long about this. I don't think it originally had chapters 1 and 2.
Another fascinating answer, because of course the first 2 chapters there are full of so much interesting material.
Boy, are they? Yeah. Yeah.
In light of that, what do you think of the idea that the gospel of the Lord, something that's supposed to be Marcion's gospel, is the earlier version of Luke, which is missing
It
the
sure
virgin birth
tracks a
and
lot of
genealogy?
Yeah.
And the beginning of it kind of sounds like a little bit, but Jesus ascending from heaven down to Capernaum. It's not completely the same, but it sounds a little like what you were saying might be the beginning of Luke.
Yeah, this is all part of the issue. So for those who don't know, Marcion is a 2nd century Christian thinker, kind of a philosopher, author, influential theological figure who maintained that the God of Jesus is a different God from the God of the Old Testament, that the God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath and justice, and the God of Jesus is God of love and mercy and forgiveness, and that they're literally different gods, and that Paul recognized that, and that Paul was the one who got it, that the law has nothing to do with Jesus. This is Marcion's view that he developed, and he was in Rome probably around 140 or so, and he has a couple of books that he relies upon for his views. We unfortunately don't have any of his writings that survive intact. We have some quotations, and we don't have his canon of scripture, which the church fathers indicated, starting with Tertullian especially, that it contained one gospel that was very much like our Luke, and 10 of Paul's letters, interestingly, without the pastorals. And so this would be very early in the 140s or so. But Tertullian also says that Marcion shortened these books. He changed these books that he had, the Gospel and Letters of Paul, because later scribes had inserted references to the Jewish God that Marcion had to get rid of because, Paul and the Gospel didn't talk about the Jewish God in connection with Jesus. So he got rid of those parts. And so the assumption is then that Marcion took out chapters 1 and 2, where you have Jesus being born of a virgin, and in Marcion's view, Jesus couldn't be born in this world because then he'd belong to the God of this world, which is the God that Jesus is opposed to. So Jesus didn't get born of a virgin or any other way. He descended from heaven as a full-grown adult in the appearance of a human. And so he didn't have chapters 1 and 2. But then all of a sudden, wait a second, this is one of our earliest references to what appears to be the Gospel of Luke, and it doesn't have chapters 1 and 2. Some scholars think that Marcion didn't change the text that he had. He just had a different text, which is completely plausible.
Site, thank you for your super chat. What's your view on the Gospel of Mary Magdalene? Could it indicate that women held a higher role in the early church?
It's a great gospel. It's one of the Gnostic Gospels. It was not found at Nag Hammadi. It was discovered in the 19th century. It turned up in the 1890s, and because of a series of really unfortunate calamities and circumstances, including world wars and such, it was in Germany. It was in Germany. It wasn't published till 1955. It's a Gnostic account that is fragmentary. We don't have the whole thing. It begins sort of in the middle of the episode where Jesus is telling his disciples, giving them an instruction that's this kind of mystical instruction about whether matter exists and whether sin exists, and then Jesus leaves them, and then Peter asks Mary, says, we know that Jesus loved you more than all other women. What did he reveal to you? And Mary starts giving a revelation to reveal what Jesus revealed to her, and right when she starts, we're missing several pages. It's like,
This would have been getting interesting.
ah. But then, right. But then it picks up where she's describing how the soul is ascending from the earthly realm up into the heavenly realm and is having to bypass the powers that are trying to keep people trapped down here, trying to keep their souls trapped down here, the powers of desire and ignorance and darkness. And the soul is escaping these to return to its heavenly realms. And this is an account of a Gnostic account of the soul returning to where it came from. When she finishes this revelation, the men disciples start looking at each other and saying, I don't think Jesus told her this. Andrew says, Jesus, I don't believe that Jesus told a woman that. And Peter said, why would he tell a woman and not tell us? No. And then Levi stands up and says, look, Peter, you're always a hothead. Just, she said he probably revealed it. He loved her more than us. And then Mary kind of blesses them, sends them out. They all go out to preach, and that's the end of it. So it's very interesting because you have a conflict between Mary and Peter, as you do in other books, including in the Gospel of John, Mary is the first to discover the tomb. This is Mary Magdalene, right? According to Paul, Peter's the first to see the resurrected Jesus. In John, it's Mary. So it's like this kind of conflict that exists throughout Christianity and kind of goes on in various other sources. So I think that the Gospel of Mary probably does show that you have people who are insisting, look, women are at least as reliable as men, as revealers of the truth. They probably have some kinds of roles in teaching, and it's showing the conflict that was happening in the early centuries. This is probably 2nd century, about conflicts between whether women are legitimately spiritual leaders or not. Gospel of Mary, absolutely yes.
That sounds like it was a real hot issue among early Christians, the role of women.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, First Timothy's opposing it, and you get passages like you get this thing in Mary, and you get the Acts of Thecla with Paul, which are supporting the roles of women, and it appears to have been a much bigger controversy than we see in the regular proto-Orthodox sources.
Even when you're going out of your way to say women shut up, you wouldn't have to say that unless it were a controversy, right? Unless there were places where women were speaking.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Last Almighty, thank you for your super chat. I'm trying to find Fee's book on the text of the Gospels and the early Fathers, but can't find it. Is there another which deals with the New Testament as found in the early patristics and manuscripts for the Fathers?
Fee's book on the text of the Gospels is one that he co-authored with me. As it turns out, it's called Origen's Text of the Fourth Gospel. The text of the Fourth Gospel in the writings of Origen. It's found in a series called the Society of Biblical Literature, New Testament, and the Greek Fathers. This area of the Church Fathers quoting the New Testament and using these patristic quotations to help reconstruct what the original New Testament said. That was what my PhD dissertation was on, and it was my field of early scholarship. When I wrote my PhD dissertation, it was on the title was Didymus the Blind and the Text of the Gospels. Didymus was a 4th century church father whose writings had been discovered in the Second World War in Egypt. They were commentaries on the Old Testament, but he frequently quoted the New Testament. And for my dissertation, directed by Bruce Metzger, I isolated all of the quotations of the Gospels in this many volumes of Greek, which had never been translated into English. There were a couple of commentaries that were in French and a couple in German, but so you have to work with that. So I collected every quotation of the Gospels, and then I compared them to about 24 surviving Greek and Latin manuscripts to see where Didymus's text agreed and disagreed with these manuscripts in order to reconstruct what Didymus's text of the Gospels looked like in the 4th century. He lived in 4th century Alexandria. So one of my inspirations for this kind of work was Gordon Fee, whom I mentioned earlier as this scholar who wrote this First Corinthians commentary, but also was a textual critic and a Pentecostal preacher. And I almost went to Boston University to do a dissertation with him, but I stayed at Princeton to do it with Metzger. But when I was finishing the dissertation, Gordon Fee had said, what we really need, he'd written this someplace, what we really need is a series where different scholars would take a different church father and show what their text of the New Testament looked like. That way, you know where the church fathers lived, you know when they lived, and so then you could isolate what the text looked like in that time and place. And so I wrote Gordon Fee. I was still a graduate student, and he was kind of a big shot in the field. I said, Dr. Fee, I think this is a great idea, and I think you could use my dissertation as the first volume. He wrote back and said, let me see it. Sent it to him and said, oh my God, yeah, this is the first volume. So it started the series.
Wonderful.
And then Gordon, he passed, then he and Mike Holmes and I wrote the one on origin. And after that, I took over the series. I was the editor for the series for a number of years. And so if you look up that series, the New Testament and the Greek Fathers, New Testament. Yeah, I think it's just called the New Testament and the Greek Fathers is what the series is called. And you'll see a number of volumes that deal with the issue. And in my book, the Didymus volume, I actually explain what the complications are of doing this use of these patristic sources, because it's not easy. And look, textual criticism generally, working with the manuscripts, is something most New Testament scholars don't want to go anywhere near. It is a really complicated, technical, and most people think completely boring enterprise. And working with the patristic evidence is one of the worst in terms of hard, but it's really important. And so that's why I devoted a lot of time to it.
Well, sounds like a worthy task to know what, we fortunately do have other Christian writers as sources in the 3rd and 4th century. And it seems to me a worthwhile thing to compare their quotations from our New Testament to what's actually in the New Testament that we have, our manuscripts of the New Testament.
Yeah. And so what you do is you figure out. So what I did, I picked a couple dozen that represent different kinds of textual traditions, and to see which ones, and you do a kind of a statistical analysis to figure out which ones it most aligns with. And it ended up meaning that I could show that the way the text developed in Alexandria, Egypt, was different from what people had earlier said. And so, but you've got to do the technical work to get to that kind of conclusion.
Really technical work. Roll up your sleeves, and this is not for amateurs, folks. Right?
Oh God, it wasn't fun. Now we have computers that can do a lot of this stuff. I was calculating all these things by hand. It was really gruesome.
Back in the old days before the internet and everything.
I think I'll write a book for popular audiences without any footnotes. That's what I'm going to do. Oh man, this is too hard.
Elias Almudi again, thank you for another super chat. You've done so many debates on the resurrection, but would you be open to debating an expert on the historicity of the crucifixion?
I guess. You mean people who doubt that Jesus was crucified? Apart from mythicists, I've never met somebody who would doubt that. But
I think he's referring to Islamic scholars.
Oh, who doubt that whether Jesus died or not, because they think he got crucified. He didn't die there, right? That'd be interesting. You wonder what kind of evidence they have. I don't even know. I mean, what evidence is there? He didn't die, apart from the fact Quran says so. I mean, what?
One central fact that all the literature agrees on is that there was this dude named Jesus who was crucified under Pilate. Yeah, so if you deny that fact, it's the one central fact that everyone seems to agree on. So
in the Quran, it says he didn't die. I mean, there's a major point, but I mean, it's not. I don't know what a historian would say about it, because as Jim says, I mean, it's like, if you look at sources, I mean, we're just not talking about gospel traditions. I mean, the whole thing. I mean, Tacitus and Josephus, and it's like everyone knows everyone knows he got crucified. So what do you? I'm not sure. It might be a short debate, but yeah. Oh, yeah. So I'm open to it, but I don't think seriously. I don't think that I can't think of a good historical argument for Jesus not being crucified and and dying. I mean, and dying on the cross.
La Salmodi, another super chat. Thanks again. I also want to get William L. Peterson's collected essays on ETTC, but I don't want to sell my kidney. Any tips?
Sell yourself into slavery? I don't know.
Well, some of these are expensive.
They're very expensive because it's by. So some of these European publishers, Brill, et cetera, are expensive. The best thing you can do is try, if you can get an interlibrary loan, if you're near a major library, or I don't really know. But the thing is, I think most of his collected essays can be found in journals. And if you are in a library that does any kind of interlibrary loan, they can probably get copies of the journal articles, or you could probably find them online if you're connected with the library. I'm spoiled in this respect because the UNC libraries, I can get most articles. It's harder to get articles that are in collected volumes as opposed to a journal. A journal article isn't that hard to get online.
But if you're I'm a friend member of the University of California, and I live here in San Diego. So just about anything, if you have a good university library nearby, through interlibrary loan can be acquired a lot cheaper than buying them.
Yeah.
So check out your university, local university library. They should probably have it.
John D., thank you for your super chat. Read your interview with Megan today. Apparently, the Vatican claims Paul's tomb was found in Rome. Can you comment on this?
So you're referring to my podcast, Misquoting Jesus. And look, for a long time, of course, there's a belief that Peter's tomb was found. And what do you say? How does one go about demonstrating that a tradition that you can trace back, even if you suppose you could trace a tradition back to the year 200, that this is so-and-so's tomb? There were reasons why Christians in various cities claimed to have connections with apostles, and claimed that the apostles founded the churches there, claim that the apostles ministered there, claims the apostles died there, claims they have relics of the apostles, because within Christianity, this gave you a sort of cachet as a church. It gave you more authority. And in almost every instance, there's no historical verification of it. There's no historical verification that Thomas went to India or that Mark founded the church in Alexandria. And there's surprisingly little evidence that Peter went to Rome. For example, we know that Paul wanted to go to Rome because in his letter to the Romans, he talks about wanting to use the Roman church as his base of operation for his mission to the west, as he wants to go to Spain. And he does go to Rome in the book of Acts, but the book of Acts is not overly reliable when it describes Paul's itinerary. In places where we can check against Paul, it's often wrong.
Can I stop you there? Does his letter to the Philippians not mention the Praetorian Guard and Caesar's household?
Yeah, the Praetorian Guard simply doesn't necessarily refer to the being in Rome. And so maybe it does. Maybe the Praetorian Guard does. But Caesar's household doesn't refer to Rome. So I'll look at that passage in Philippians. It's been a long time since I don't think I read Philippians in 50 years. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. I'm joking. I need to look at the Praetorian Guard thing. That might be an argument, but I've never heard that. I'll have to look at that. In any event, suppose you've got some church that says this we've known for 100 years this is where Paul was buried. How do you verify it? You can't take DNA. I mean, you don't know what Paul's DNA looked like. And you can show that somebody was buried. It's kind of like the Shroud of Turin. Even if you can show that if somebody was crucified, okay, well, that's nice. You show like somebody crucified in the first century. Okay. So among the 100,000 people crucified in the first century, which one is this? So the question is verification. And I don't think that Vatican claiming something is evidence. And I don't think even a third century source is evidence.
Oh, darn.
Sorry. Well,
no, but it's well known.
How would you know? I mean,
Yeah,
what do? You do you take out the tomb and find out whether he's decapitated or not? I mean, what do you do to demonstrate? Lots of people are decapitated in Rome as well. Plus, I don't think Paul was decapitated. Frankly, the idea that Paul was decapitated. Do y'all know the story about this? We're going overtime, but we're going. The Acts of Paul describes the martyrdom of Paul. And Nero's all ticked off because Paul's convincing people to follow Jesus instead of following Nero. Jesus is Lord instead of Nero being Lord. And so he decides to execute Paul. And Paul says, well, you can execute me, but you can't kill me because I'm going to come back and see you afterwards. And so Nero sends him off to the executioner. The executioner chops off his head with a sword. That was reserved for Roman citizens. Okay, so apart from legendary accounts, Roman citizens, if they suffered capital punishment, were to be decapitated, beheaded, because it was seen to be kind of the least painful of the bad options. And so, Paul's decapitated because in the Acts of Paul, he's a Roman citizen. But in the Acts of Paul, his head gets lopped off and milk starts pouring out of his neck, not blood. What? Milk? And the author doesn't explain it, but I think it's because milk is what you feed newborns. And Paul now has been born again to his new life. And so he hasn't died. He's been brought back to life through his death. So that's the Acts of Paul. That's the first account we have of it. The other thing I'll say, though, is that in the book of Acts, Paul's also said to be a Roman citizen. And I don't think there's any evidence Paul was a Roman citizen. He doesn't say anything about it. I think it's highly unlikely that Paul was a Roman citizen. He's a lower class. I mean, he works with his hands. He's not connected. Jews could be Roman citizens, but I don't think there's anything to suggest Paul was.
Isn't that about the same time that?
I'm sorry.
Okay, I was just gonna say. It's not about the same time that we first hear about Paul died under Nero, because you were mentioning earlier the earliest account of his death is mentioned by First Clement, but even that text doesn't specifically claim it happened under Nero.
It doesn't say. It doesn't say, and there are pretty good reasons for thinking Paul probably died in the 60s. I mean, he must have been in his 60s at that point. I mean, I think he was an adult when he converted. I don't think he was a teenager. If he converted around the year 33, then in the mid 60s, he'd be fairly well along. I mean, Seneca, who's living at the same time, when he's around, in his about mid 60s, he's talked about what an old man he is now, and he expects to die soon. And that's kind of typical that you don't have long expectancies. I don't think Paul could have lived much beyond the 60s. I don't think there's good evidence that he was martyred by Nero, but this is the martyrdom of Paul which is probably part of the legendary Acts of Paul. It's circulated separately, but it probably is the first time that Nero's mentioned.
Seneca was certainly forced into suicide by Nero. I mean, Seneca was a victim of Nero, even though he had been a close associate of Nero's.
He had been his tutor and his advisor, and for many years, Seneca actually ran the empire apparently. But Nero didn't like his stoic ways. He didn't like his strict ethics, and so finally, when he got older, he just got rid of him.
He dies in 65. That got us any idea about Paul. But Paul is a literate fellow. I mean, Paul does.
He's literate. He's got an education. Yes.
So he's not, he does. The tradition again says he's, works with his hands. But do we really know much about Paul?
we don't know a lot. He himself indicates that he works with his hands. It's not just Acts, which says that he's works with leather, but
Right.
he talks about working with his hands day and night. And so it looks like he goes into places and sets up shop of some kind and is some kind of manual labor. And so he may be that he's what sociologists might call mixed status. So some people like Seneca have a very high status.
Right.
He's an equestrian. He's not a senator, but I guess he does end up joining the Senate. But he's not from the senatorial class originally, and he's one of the wealthiest human beings on the planet. Seneca is, and he's extremely high educated. Everything is a high level class status symbol. With Paul, it looks like it's a mixed bag because he's highly literate, which would make him at a higher status, and so he's educated. That's a high status thing, but he's also poor, which is low status, and works with his hands, which is low status. And so you have people like that are kind of mixed status. I mean, some people became highly educated because they were slaves.
Slavery couldn't hire Greek slaves to be their tutors for Roman aristocrats.
Yeah.
So
I've sometimes kind of casually wondered if one could make the argument that Paul started out as a slave. He certainly loves calling himself the slave of Christ. And it would explain his high literacy. I don't know. I just played with the idea. I'm not going to.
That's not too much.
Let's take a couple more super chats before we close. Patrick Henry, thank you for your super chat. Is the idea of a Zealot Jesus similar to saying that there was a historical Robin Hood, but he stole from the poor and gave to the rich? Can such an individual really be called the historical Jesus?
There. Y'all blanked out on me there for about 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll repeat what the super chat says. Patrick Henry says, is the idea of a Zealot Jesus similar to saying that there was a historical Robin Hood, but he stole from the poor and gave to the rich? Can such an individual really be called the historical Jesus?
I'm not sure I'm getting the Robin Hood connection. How would he rob from the poor and give to? I don't quite get that. If Jesus were several things. One is
now Dr. Ehrman froze.
Yeah, he froze again.
Let's see if we can get him back. In the Gospels, Jesus tells the rich young man to sell his property and give it to the poor. The poor are the ones we're supposed to be helping. Yeah. I think we got Dr. Ehrman back.
You got me back. I'm sorry. It looks like our internet's going crazy here. So,
okay.
Zealot is a term used by Josephus to refer to rebels during the Jewish uprising in 66 to 73. And so it wouldn't be applicable. The technical term wouldn't apply to Jesus. The question is he like one of those who wants to overthrow the Romans through military force? That, of course, is the argument of Reza Aslan in his book Zealot. Reza didn't come up with that idea. It is the oldest idea of the historical Jesus in critical scholarship. It was first pronounced by Hermann Samuel Reimarus in his posthumous work published in the 1770s. And so Reza doesn't acknowledge that, but it's a view that's been around for a long time. And so the question is, did Jesus believe in a violent overthrow of the Roman government? If he did, then it wouldn't be robbing from the poor to give to the rich. It would be taking back what is theirs, taking back the land from the Romans. I don't think it's at all likely that that's what Jesus was up to. I think, in fact, it's contrary to Jesus' message. I think that Jesus did think there'd be a massive destruction and that the Romans would be wiped out, but it was because God's going to do it. It's not going to be because of a Jewish army. And so I think Jesus was opposed to taking up the sword against the Romans, and that I think he really said things like the one who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And I think that I don't think he supported violent opposition.
What makes you think that? What makes you think, for example, that element was not later, like the Torah criticism element in Paul was introduced later? I mean, I think you get the definite impression that he's an apocalyptic preacher for sure, but surely apocalypse was more the genre of these rebels before the war.
Well, you had to, it could have been. We don't know really what the religious ideology of the Zealots were, apart from they wanted the land back. They
The
thought the land
Romans
was
seem to have thought him a real threat, a threat big enough to crucify.
sometimes, depending on what they were doing. But they weren't crucified for. They weren't. Okay, so let me explain it like this. There are two kinds of Jewish apocalypticists. There are more than two. It's like saying there are two kinds of Protestant. There are two kinds of Jewish apocalypticists. Some think that God is going to intervene soon, and there's going to be a major war, and they're going to be involved in it. You get that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the War Scroll, there's going to be a 40-year war where they take up the sword and they're on the side of God. And it takes them 40 years. I don't know why God's war takes 40 years, but it takes them 40 years, and they win the war. There are other Jewish apocalypticists that were not interested in violence. They thought that God himself was going to overthrow the enemy, and that there was no need to interfere. And so you get both of those things kind of now today, I guess, even still, with people believing the end of the world's coming soon, whether they're going to kind of facilitate it or not. I do think that Jesus was the latter type. I think that he was nonviolent. Part of the reason is because the nonviolence is scattered throughout so many of the sources that it's independently attested all over the place. And it coincides with other teachings of Jesus that seem to be contrary to what the early Christians said. For example, love your enemies. Most Christians are not interested in loving their enemies. So when Jesus says things like love your neighbors yourself, and he defines it as somebody who's a Samaritan, who's the enemy. I don't think so. I'm of the persuasion that Jesus was a proponent of nonviolence, and that he thought that in fact taking up the sword was a show of distrust. God's going to do this. That's how I work it out. So I've written a bit about this, trying to show why I think that these sword sayings and stuff, what goes back to Jesus and what doesn't. But it's a judgment. It's a judgment call.
I mean, we're specifically told one of his disciples is called a zealot.
Yeah, but that can't be historical because there weren't zealots yet.
Right. Well, certainly true, but we were also told the disciples are supposed to all have swords. I'm going to try and give the best argument I can here.
Yeah, we're told Jesus walked on the water, and so there are things that some of the early Christians definitely believed in violence, and so I think the way it happened was, I'll tell you, it's really hard to make these connections, but my view is that what happened was Jesus really said something like, don't take up the sword. You take up the sword, you'll die by the sword. In other words, you're going to get crushed. That ain't the way to go, because he really thought God was going to do it. These sayings about the Son of Man coming, the Son of Man's the one who destroys everything.
Right.
And so there's nothing about an army or anything like that. So I think Jesus really said, don't take up the sword. Take up the sword, you'll die by the sword. I think what ends up happening is that what often happens, it looks like, is that you have a saying that turns into a story to provide the context for the saying. See what I mean? It'd be like, and so I've seen this happen all the time in my own life, where there'll be something like, we had stories about Bruce Metzger, my teacher, and you have these one-liners, and then all of a sudden some stories would crop up that would kind of show the context for these one-liners. And it's like, whoa. And I saw it happen. So I think stuff like that did happen. And scholars since the 1920s have said that happened with Jesus. I think Jesus said, take up the sword, die by the sword. And the narrative that got invented around that is that Jesus came to be arrested, and his disciples pulled out a sword to defend him. And then he says, well, you take out the sword, you die by the sword. And so, I don't think his followers are armed, probably. And I don't think that he was encouraging violence or anything like that.
Let's look at the next super chat. Johannine Torres, thank you for your super chat. What the heck is the Holy Spirit in the New Testament? Gospels, Paul. My fundy background says part of the Trinity. What is the academic view?
So the Spirit of God is a figure that goes back to the Old Testament. You find it in Genesis 1. The Spirit of God is brooding over the water when God creates the heavens and the earth. The Spirit of God shows up throughout the Hebrew Bible. It seems to be a kind of a divine presence of God on earth in spiritual form, in non-bodily form at times. It becomes a major figure in the New Testament, where the Spirit impregnates Mary in Luke, and the Spirit comes upon Jesus in all the Gospels, and the Spirit empowers Jesus in the Gospel of Luke to do his miracles, and the Spirit of God comes upon the disciples on Pentecost. And so the God Spirit is just part of the Jewish tradition that Christians take up. What ends up happening is that the Christians, after Jesus' death, believe that he gets raised from the dead, and they come to think that he's been made a divine being, that he's been exalted to divinity. He is a divine being. They start calling Jesus God. But in one of the Gospels, the Gospel of John, Jesus indicates that when he leaves, the Spirit will come, the Spirit of comfort, who will direct the disciples. And it sounds like he says another comforter or another advocate, another paraclete will come. And so it sounds like this is like somebody who's on Jesus' level, who's going to take over when Jesus physically leaves. What ends up happening in Christianity is they start thinking that there are these three divine figures. There's God, the Father, and his Son, Jesus, and then the Spirit that came after Jesus. And already in the 2nd century, all three are being called divine. The doctrine of the Trinity is not worked out for a long time. The term Trinity appears already in the writings of Tertullian. Tertullian considers all three to be God, but he doesn't have the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is a specific formulation about how Father, Spirit, and Son relate to each other. And in the specific formulation that develops in the clearest form at the end of the 4th century, the formulation is that there are three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. These are distinct persons. They're not the same person. They're three distinct persons. All three of them are God, and in fact, they're all equally God. They're all made of the same substance. And so you've got three persons, all made of the same substance, equally God, distinct from one another, but there's only one God. That's the doctrine of the Trinity. You don't get that in the New Testament. Matthew doesn't say it when he says, baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You got the three people there, but you don't have the doctrine of the Trinity. You don't have the three are equally God, made of the same substance, and yet there's only one God. That's the doctrine of the Trinity. Don't get that till the end of the 4th century.
Gary Picro, hope I pronounced your last name correctly. Thank you for your super chat. Thanks for the fascinating show. Well, thank you, Gary. Really appreciate it.
Well, I want to just thank Professor Ehrman for this interview as well. I find conversations with you, sir, always enlightening. And again, I really want to recommend to all of our viewers that they check out your work. Your work is always mind expanding. And if you want to be introduced to this, there are a lot of people out there who really aren't familiar and want to be introduced. Your works are my go-to place, Professor Ehrman, to send them. They really are the best introduction to this material. And as I say, thank you very, very much for this conversation. I always learn, really.
Well, thank you. And the only suggestion I'd make about using my books as an entree to this is do not start with Didymus the Blind and the text of the Gospels.
Well, Russell, thank you for your super chat. And yes, I second everything that James said. And I really love your book, Forged, Bart.
Oh,
I think it's probably my favorite one. I just can't stop looking at it. It's like I got to get you back on my show. We got to do 2 hours on this.
Yeah, no, it's great. Well, I'll tell you, my favorite book is always the one I just wrote. So right now, Armageddon is my favorite book, and it's the best I've written by a long shot. And so
your next one comes out. Yeah.
What a complex subject that is. Talk about related to apocalypse and the meaning of Revelation. I mean, there's talk about a fascinating.
There's a lot there. It's a lot there, and it's really. I actually didn't know how interesting it was until I got seriously into the book, and man, yeah, it's interesting stuff. So, yeah. So, well, look, thank you too, because this has been a very wide-ranging conversation, and I enjoy that kind of thing a lot because it keeps one on one's toes. So,
And I would like,
appreciate it.
And I would like to thank everybody for super chatting their questions. They were good questions, and I'll see everybody later. Thank you both.
Take care.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.